Thanks so much, Danny. Thanks, Retzi. Thanks, everyone. It's okay? You like it? Yeah? It's such a pleasure to be back. Thanks for your hospitality, especially on this inaugural event. 210 of you here. The map is really, really impressive. I wanted to just begin by acknowledging my indebtedness to this place. You know, I think you know because you're here already. This place has been for the past 2 decades a school that's gone from being an idea, basically, a kind of radical idea, to one of the most important schools for innovation and experimentation and design in the world. And I'm not overstating that. You've seen the map. It's an extraordinary group of people that you're joining, so welcome. I'm so very honored to be here on this inaugural occasion. You know, thanks to Vicente, thank you so much, Areti, thank you, Danny, for your hospitality. I'm going to try to do with 2 hands 3 different things here, so bear with me. I thought I would begin just by way of cross-cultural exchange coming from the States to share with you briefly 3 news items coming from Catalonia that have made their way through the noise to our audiences on the East Coast, at least. I don't know where you are on these topics, but I just thought I would share with you the kinds of things that we're seeing coming out of the study of urbanism in Catalonia. This is the first. An extraordinary, organic, emergent, empathetic, human response to a set of conditions in the city. And I know this is old news here. For us, this has been so radical. It is changing the way people think about the city. It's changing the way that people think about their commutes. It's changing the way they think about their families. And this is among the most important lessons coming out of Catalonia in the past years. It's being widely, you know, experimented with across the US. On the other hand, we have some questions about this. Now, I don't know how many of you here know, I've been asking on my tour of the city, seeing old friends and new, does anyone know Bussy? Anyone here know Bussy? Nobody here is, thank you, in the back. What do we know about Bussy? What should we learn about this? Well, I've learned it's in Sabadell, which is not here. This is in the provinces somewhere. But apparently there is a pushback on the Bissy bus, which is in the form of this guy, which is giving us all nightmares on social media in the States, just so you're aware. And then the third thing has been this. I know this is an ongoing, you know, project. It's recently been inaugurated, and I'm here just to pay just all due respect. This is an extraordinarily important moment. The rhetorical act, the simple, it's obviously a complex project, but the simple rhetorical act of, on that sacred ground, saying it will be timber, mass is more, is among the most important experiments we've seen in recent memory, and it's to your collective credit, so bravo. The first thing to say is the work that I'll share with you is itself a work of collaboration. So I'm here to represent it, and I'm happy to be responsible for any of its failures, but it is a collective work. It comes from this research group that we lead. The Office for Urbanization works with cities, works with folks, works with communities around the world. And our primary mission is to try to imagine alternative and better urban futures. We do this often through a form of scenario planning. This particular project, 50 Species Towns, began with the contributions from a couple of our key staff, a couple of our key researchers, Charlie Gaillard, Mariano Gomez, Luque Mercedes Peralta, Min Yao, and Boya Zhang. And they come from Korea and China and Argentina and the US and other parts in the world. So it's itself the work of a team. We also work closely with faculty across the disciplines, both in the design school and at Harvard. It's the resultant of a 3-year research project. It takes the form of a book. It's a book which we are placing in all the libraries that we visit on our book tour. So there will be books arriving here in the fullness of time in the coming weeks. And we can talk about that part of it if you're interested in it. In short, the project proposes a new paradigm for the development of agricultural new towns in China. Now, I don't know to what extent you've been following this story, But effectively, agricultural modernization is one of the most important conversations in China just now in the past 5 years or so. We do so through the conception of particular heritage crops, and that these crops really are derived from their significance in material, culture, culinary history, and they constitute invaluable cultural heritage. Our first premise in doing the book was that in working with our friends and colleagues in China and coming from the outside, we had to learn quite a lot. And it's our kind of working hypothesis, you can see it documented here, that every period of agricultural development or every period of agricultural urbanization in Chinese history has been accompanied with a form of imaginary. And I would say this for all peoples, not just for the Chinese, that in fact, living in a certain way, you know, the image of the city is itself a kind of collective imaginary project. And in some cases, it takes the form of, you know, kind of propagandistic images. And other times it takes the form of real estate brochures or, you know, TikTok viral videos. It changes in each era, in each place. But my premise, and this applies not just to the agrarian, but also to the way that we think about the city, is that the city is a collective work of imagination. We all inhabit a different imaginary, but collectively we somehow conspire to think about it in a certain way. And that imagination most often precedes need. That is, the city is not a response to demand. It's most often a kind of projection of power relationships or will or desire or a variety of other things. This work is informed and really shaped in response to the 13th five-year plan of the Chinese Party, which in 2016 proposed a series of reforms. They're aspiring to improve the living and working conditions in rural life across the country. Their goal is to develop specialized and local economies and to draw the agricultural activity of this country into the economy. You may know that following Deng Xiaoping's openings and the kind of neoliberal kind of capitalism of state capitalism of China, the Agrarian Village is the last place that has not really been incorporated. So a part of this is the integration into the modern economy. They're simultaneously trying to produce greater surpluses of calories through large monocultural grains, you know, wheat and rice and soy, using genetically modified crops and a range of other new technologies from the Canadians and the Dutch, while simultaneously trying to become more environmentally or ecologically informed. So they're doing a little bit what we did in the US in the 20th century, but also trying to incorporate more contemporary or progressive ideas about the environment. As they do so, their goals include the incorporation of a kind of touristic economy, one based on recreation and leisure, and all of these accumulate to try to provide an economic mechanism to take pressure off of the primary cities across China. And as they do, incorporating information technology and a range of other, effectively mechanizing the entirety of the agricultural process across China. Of course, in order to do this, they face enormous challenges. And our perspective on this has been one of empathy. I think these are real challenges, but of course, among the challenges they face are desertification and climate change, challenges with respect to water infrastructure, transportation, energy. All of these are, of course, enormous, enormous challenges. The local and specific county economies and their products are central to this effort, and they inform the work that we're doing. After working with our friends in China for several years, essentially advising them, providing a kind of peer review, looking at their practices and gathering faculty and professional expertise, we took a step back and produced this research, which is effectively a kind of counter proposal to what they're doing. It's an alternative vision. The primary goal is to avoid repeating the history of North America in the 20th century. In the US and Canada in the 20th century, we erased our cultural heritage, not to mention the indigenous foodways that were erased through the original kind of genocide of the Colombian encounter. And in response, our argument is, in modernizing agriculture, how might we help the Chinese avoid making that mistake of losing that invaluable cultural heritage? We've, of course, done quite a lot of work on identities, demographies, who lives in these places, who might want to do what in these places. And we've done quite a deep dive into what UNESCO refers to as metrics and measures of intangible cultural heritage. These are often performance art, dance, theater. They form a variety of different topics. We've worked closely with Chinese experts and their knowledge on their own heritage crops that are quite vulnerable. And they have a list of something like 80 of them, of which we've identified the 50 that are the most valuable and then also the most vulnerable. Among all the various precedents we've studied, the project owes a real debt of gratitude to one precedent project in particular. This is the work of Dr. Kong Jianyu, and his firm is called Tourandscape. He's, I think, arguably one of the most important landscape architects working in the world today. About 20 years ago, 2002, Tourandscape, Kong Jianyu were invited to plan the kind of landscape plan for a new university campus. This became the Shenyang Architectural University. He was very happy to receive this commission. He was a little disappointed to find that, of course, the planners and the architects that planned the campus had erased the agricultural activity there, built all the new buildings, which were fantastic, and spent all the money. It's a classic story for a landscape architect. In a kind of sleight of hand, what Kong Jianyu said, well, if you have no money and you're opening in a month, I'm simply going to ask the farmers you displaced to put the rice back. And this becomes the fabric of the campus plan. So there's a kind of double reading going on where on the one hand, it's a Western style, a kind of an American style campus with a lush planting with alleys and pathways and a kind of pastoral setting. But the materiality is constituted of the material that the farmers knew. It's the wet rice farming construct that makes the fabric of the campus. Of course, it provides the kinds of campus amenity you would associate with certain forms of campus life. And perhaps most importantly for our purposes, what it did was it became the identity of the institution. It became the calendar of events with harvest cycles and planting festivals. And I don't know where you guys are in urban agriculture, or if we're going to mobilize 210 or 260 to plant stuff, but the idea that the rice became the mascot of the sports team. It's sold in the bookshop, right? It becomes, so this has been, I think, among the most important case studies in landscape architecture in the past 2 decades. It's, I think, understudied, underreported. But it's been really, really powerful in my thinking about this project. Nobody wants to live in Newtown 47B. Let me ask it as a question. Who wants to move into Newtown 47B? We tried this. It failed, right? It was the first lesson I learned in architecture school, the failure of our modernist grandparents. It didn't work, right? And so our counter proposal is to identify those most valuable heritage crops, and from each of those heritage crops to derive an identity for a particular new town. These are small, these are 25 to 50,000 people in relatively agricultural settings. And as opposed to other forms of development, the idea here was a kind of thought experiment where we challenged ourselves to try to answer every question about this new town, not from the point of view of the desire of the designer or what the mayor is interested in, or your uncle has a piece of land, or Vicente can say, well, here's what we should do. Our goal was, what if we answered every decision from the point of view of the species in question? Would that be possible? From the point of view of a selfish gene theory. So I don't know how many of you know selfish gene theory, but the basic idea is we haven't cultivated the apple or marijuana or the tulip. They've manipulated us, right? From a selfish gene point of view, those genetic materials are only interested in their own reproduction, and they have intoxicated us through beauty or alcohol or other means to have us be doing the work for them. So from that admittedly specific or maybe even perverse point of view, the thought exercise was, how can we use this as a way to critique the existing kind of neoliberal practice of land development and come at this from the point of view of what the species might want? What does the plant want to be? Don't worry, we're not going to do all 50. We have a little starter course of 3 with a couple of photographic portfolios. The jujube, or Chinese date, Ziziphus jujuba, grows in the northern latitudes of China, 29 to 50 north, in a temperate semi-arid climate. In Jia County, they've cultivated jujube fruit for over 3,000 years, and there are individual trees in those gardens that are over 1,000 years old. We're interested here, of course, in the botanical history, the coloration. We're also interested in the material culture that comes from the jujube. In this case, you can see the extraordinary festival in Jia County around the Jia cake ceremony. And our premise here is that rather than us coming in from the outside and imagining how people might live, our argument is that people are already living. They've been living for thousands of years in a very particular set of relationships, and we're simply there to acknowledge it from the outside and suggest, well, this might be a way to think about living in this place. In addition to the material culture and the seasonality, we're equally interested in the coloration, because this coloration ends up making its way into the ground, into the hillside, into the building fabric, into the clothing, into the material culture of the place. But we're also interested in the growth logic, the morphology of this plant, the cultivation pattern, the way that these fields have been tended. And the combination of those things add up to something that gives us like a kind of lived experience, but which is made meaningful because of our relationship to that species. And I don't know where you are on jujube or if your mother fed it to you as a child, but the idea that these were specific products and specific cultural heritage that were built for thousands of years before we got to the problem is fundamental to us, and it gives us some hope. In addition to that, we're interested to propose not only a material culture or an anthropological or empathetic response, we also want to grow a town. And so we've attempted in these pages to derive the urban form, the urban morphology from the growth logic of the plant itself. And I'm aware that, Christopher Alexander and others have argued that the city is not a tree, and our answer is, well, it could be. The city has to look like something. And against other models of urbanization, we propose that there might be something here. In addition to looking at the specific land and cultural conditions, specific species and its expression, we've also looked deeply at the patterns of urbanization that exist before our work. We've identified in the literature, there are 18 very particular village typologies, this block structure and building form. And what we've done here in a collaboration with Andrew Witt, this firm called Certain Measures, we did an analysis where we scanned thousands of buildings and blocks in this region of China associated with a very particular urban form. You can see here on the right, among the hundreds of the examples that we scanned, and on the left, a kind of X-ray composite, putting those together. I'll say more about that in a minute. From that, we then try to derive an urban typology. So we've talked about morphology, the overall gross physiognomy, the shape of the body. We're also interested now in the shape of the building type, from very small, low density, one building per acre kind of pavilions in the suburbs, all the way through kind of low rise, through a kind of middle density. And from that, we do a kind of petri dish, kind of tabletop exercise, to then begin to think about, well, what would be the shape of this town? What would be the derivation of the jujube as a kind of urban form? And unlike other projects, unlike the way in which so many urban decisions get made, in this case, in terms of deriving an ideal site for this project, we again return to the species itself and asked it for its ideal soil. What is its ideal climate? What is the sweet spot in terms of south-facing slope? How much water? And tried to derive a kind of site specificity for the jujube, ultimately giving us a kind of a way of thinking about this as a place which is on the one hand is a part of an agricultural modernization program, but is deeply specific to this particular site in Jia County. The literature is quite clear that there are three very different agrarian shapes or morphologies in different parts of China, in the north, in the center, and in the south. And within that, there are a variety of shapes and structures. We've done quite a lot of work to try to scan and derive our patterns from that. So there would be a kind of sympathetic relationship. What we added to that were our own workflows for a latitudinal contextualism, as well as a kind of thermodynamic response. We're interested in responding to Ken Franklin's notion of a critical regionalism, but as opposed to doing it through national culture or specific local identity, doing it through latitude and thermal response, a kind of thermodynamic playbook, which we can talk about more in a minute. Against that, we try to juxtapose the photographic portfolios from a range of photographers. This is Zhao Zhu, the photography of Zhao Zhu. And Zhao Zhu was born in mainland China and has been since '99 practicing in the Netherlands, where they were trained as photographers. So we have a couple of photographers who were born in China, immigrated to Europe, were trained in photography or the fine arts, and then went back. We find that these images do a couple of things. They cut against the kind of abstraction and the kind of projective nature of the work. They're equally empathetic. They also reveal a kind of situatedness on the ground, it's kind of very specific facticity to these things that we think cuts through and enables us to think about materiality, think about the conditions of light and air on the ground. The book is organized, as you can see on the right-hand side, with a series of the 50 by latitude. So the most northern latitudes at the top, working down through. So there's a kind of encyclopedic, kind of taxonomic desire. And then we enter another of the 50. Equally, rape seeds have been cultivated in the central latitudes of China for thousands of years. You can see them here in this one festival. They produce this extraordinary, almost Ukrainian yellow horizon condition. What's interesting about the rapeseed is that in part, it was a part of a closed loop agricultural system with fish farming, where the waste material of one cycle produced the fertilizer for the next. This allowed for maintaining for thousands of years of a kind of raised bed or raised pond kind of agricultural formulation. Equally, a fantastically rich material palette, but a very, very different growth logic, a different relationship to solar orientation, a different relationship to the ground plane, and therefore a different morphology. A different village structure, because we're in a different region of China, and ultimately a different typology, in this case, much more like the growth logic of the rapeseed. The rapeseed is primarily used for canola oil. It produces about half the vegetable oil in China, and therefore constitutes a very, very important, quite valuable piece of our economy, not just cultural heritage. I mentioned this question of agrarian or rural type. Typology was, of course, an idea that was quite central to architectural thinking in the kind of, the end of the modern period, in the kind of height of postmodernism, I think 70s, 80s, 90s. What we found is that in the literature, there are these 18 typologies of village structure that have been quite well documented since the 1980s. We, of course, went to China many times. We spent quite a lot of time in their libraries and archives in the field. We were also happy to find all this literature in Mandarin on the Harvard campus. So it was there, and it was quite well documented. A part of what our interest here is to kind of critique this notion of the idealized body. You can see here on the left-hand side, top left, up there, the kind of idealized plan, just above me here on the right. That idealized plan has been a kind of convention for a half century or more. And we come to think of it like a kind of Vitruvian man or some kind of idealized body. It's sort of not really corporate, it's not really material, it doesn't really exist in the world. It's a kind of perfection, it's kind of idealized image. And compared to that, we then wanted to see, well, what were the actual villages like? Let's scan thousands of them. Let's see what those spatial structures look like. And so on the left is our response to the classical ideal body, which is actual bodies. We find actual bodies far more interesting than ideal bodies. And so we get something more like a demography, a public health, a distribution curve. And we do that across all 18. So you can see here the hundreds that we can show of the thousands we scanned, the composite, to give you a sense of, well, what are the limits of these particular typologies? And then on the right, you see a diagram of latitude and orientation to solar performance. So we're trying to understand deeply, not just the perfection, the way that we've recorded it as an optimized end game, but rather as something that we share. In that sense, the idea of having actual populations to work with is something that our tools allow us today, but is different than thinking about big data in a kind of top-down or kind of teleological way. These are photographs by Toul and Bruno Morandi. Toul Morandi was born on the steppes in the northwest China, immigrates to Paris, where she studied fine arts and photography, meets Bruno, the architect. They form a collaborative partnership, and they make these photographs in Chengdu of a tea ceremony. You may be aware that in the past decades, Chinese leadership And Chinese architects have become mindful of their own heritage, their own cultural preservation, and forms of tangible cultural heritage, especially building fabric, that are being preserved. But what we've seen more recently is a kind of building of these kinds of economies, the development of touristic experience, culinary heritage, and the beginnings, just the earliest beginnings of a kind of branding of certain kinds of cultural products. What would be the classic Catalonian like brand mark protected product? What's the equivalent of like champagne in France or bourbon in Kentucky? I was just in Lisbon, in Portugal, it's port wine. You know, and in the West, these things are now self-evident. The idea that, well, no, it's champagne, you have to call it sparkling wine, that's mine, right? That kind of branding is something that's centuries years old. It's well predates the European Union, obviously, but that idea is something that's very, I think, captivating for the Chinese just now. So after decades of importing, you know, European and North American standards for grape varietals or standards for different types of things, they're moving now into this notion of how do we commodify our own cultural heritage, our own cultural landscapes, but connect them to brands that can produce value-added products, right? Because for a long time, they've been importing technology, importing tourists. And of course, many of these species, certainly the tea terraces, are, you know, deeply embedded in kind of the cultural landscapes of China. So that's important to our work. But this notion of deriving certain place-specific, destination-worthy, can we say that? Destination-worthy, where would you get on a plane to go to? Where would you get on a train or a bus? Where would you drive to for a certain kind of experience, right? So you can begin to see, I hope, this mix of tourism beginning to integrate with a new economy, with the branding of certain kinds of products, right? That mix, I think, Toole and Bruno Morandi, I think, capture that mix quite well. Third, the Tianjin pepper. The Tianjin pepper is not native to China. It came from South America, Bolivia, and Paraguay. It entered China in the 14th, 15th century. Mao Zedong had some very highly developed opinions about the pepper that I won't comment on. But what we do here with the botanical illustration and the coloration, we also try to find some literature, some literary or poetic experience associated, because each of these plants, what I find them so amazing is they have these extraordinarily important literatures across the spectrum of cultural productions: painting, opera, dance, and we put them in our bodies. There's nothing more intimate or more personal than that. And so I'm hopeful, I'm optimistic that that approach to species that have been important, plants and their products that have been important to people for thousands of years, will allow us some way to kind of balance or mitigate the challenge of an ongoing modernity. The Tianjin pepper, of course, begins its life as an import, not as food, but as medicine. And there's an important, I think, as you may know, a kind of nexus between the medicinal, the caloric, and the cultural in Chinese culinary history. Eventually, it comes to be a form of food preservation, and as a food method, it then becomes a form of cuisine that's associated with certain places, certain parts of China. And if you talk to many Chinese, you know, they won't necessarily identify by hometown. They not always just by linguistic region, very often by food region, right? What kind of food do you eat? Which is a surrogate for humidity and temperature and terrain and topos and all of those things, and is deeply, deeply personal. And as my friend Stan Fong, the Chinese landscape historian, reminded me that, you know, not everyone likes Tianjin peppers, but they're still deeply meaningful, even if you react in opposition to these things. And so again, the idea of a unique morphological structure, a unique growth logic, a unique cultivation pattern that produces, again, a distinct, you know, kind of typological variety. And I don't want to make greater claims than that for these experiments. That's what they are. These are experiments. But my premise here, and the reason that we've been, you know, going on about this for a little bit now is, it strikes me that, you know, we live in a period where we've kind of shrunk back or abandoned the idea of thinking about the shape of the new town. And I say that broadly, of course. The world continues to urbanize, but in institutions like yours and in mine, we've internalized the failures of the modern project. We've somehow internalized a kind of guilt for the failure of the modern era to accommodate this structure of growth. And at the same moment, we've fallen back on a kind of, I think, a kind of belief that if we can structure the city in an historic way, in a way which is culturally conservative, that we might recapture some of the social or environmental values we feel like we've lost. We're sitting here, okay? So I want to put these in quotation marks, but sitting here, what I want to say to you is I do believe that we can collectively improve the conditions for people living in the world. Not for everyone everywhere, not in all times, but if we're careful about our work and if we're thoughtful about it, I believe that we can improve conditions. And one of the central challenges that I've seen is the challenge of reconciling this tension, this dialectic between the forces of modernity, particularly capital and its tendency to erase, versus local and specific cultural memory. Personally, for me, the Enlightenment is still an incomplete project. What I mean by that is I am deeply committed to the structure of the university, class mobility, identity self-formation, the idea of that map of 60 places around the world that we're all coming to be here. I'm deeply committed to that project. That's what I do for a living. That's why I'm doing what I do. But how do we reconcile that with the loss of local and cultural specificity? We are here in Catalonia, right? We're here in Barcelona. We're here in a place that's has been living through that reconciliation as an ongoing project. I'm not suggesting to you that it's easy, but I believe it's time for designers to also be in the arena. I believe that we have to be foot forward. We have to have propositions on the table that are operational. And I don't mean to suggest that's easy, but rather than simply stepping back and saying, well, the market will sort it out, or somehow historic cultures going back to some pre-modern era will solve itself. I think that we should be at that table, empathetic, well-intentioned, informed, humble, but at the same moment, we need new tools. We need new tools and ways of thinking about intervening in places. And for me, that in the next decade of my career, that food culture, the specificity of food culture from which we can get to cultural landscapes, urban form, lived experiences, I think the best option we've got, I believe, going forward, thinking about the shape of the city and agricultural life. Above all, this work is for us. It's an approach to be critical and speculative, and ultimately is an opening to a conversation rather than closing things out. It's something that I'm hopeful will be interesting for us to discuss here in the coming minutes. But thank you again so very much for your hospitality. It's lovely to be back with you all.
Right, Charles, thank you for that beautiful introduction to this amazing book. I would like to welcome to the stage our very own Vicente Guayar to join us here for some conversation. So, Charles, thank you. I think Vicente doesn't need introduction, but I'll say a couple of few words about our one of our IAAC founders. As you guys know, Vicente, which is very prolific in many different fields and areas of engagement, from academia, research, but also practice. It's particularly relevant, I think, for the conversation tonight because of his work in China. As you very well know, he has been very active there. I would say more on the urban agglomeration front rather than on the kind of rural side of things. But nonetheless, I think very interesting also to engage with Charles in a conversation. So I have prepared maybe a few questions slash reflections that hopefully we can see where they lead. And as I was saying before, hopefully we can open up the discussion with all of you later on. So Charles, I would like to maybe start with a very specific question, which is rather short, which is is this book in a way a new turn on the kind of seminal research that the landscape urbanism reader did on this role of landscape being both medium and model for urbanism. In the past, you have been kind of claiming that from a more kind of theoretical perspective, and how, you know, questions of topography, water drainage, soil composition, vegetation types could inform the way we design things. And, you know, I find this as a beautiful kind of very specific, very kind of locally informed example of kind of that, you know, more discursive work that you have been over the years. So in a way, the first question for you is that a fair affirmation? Can you help us as well to understand how this very specific book project falls within your kind of larger trajectory of your own you know, theory and discourse of, in this case, of landscape urbanism?
Sure. How many pages do you have?
5.
Vanyas is always prepared. It's something that I've known about Danny for a long time. Yeah, so the short version would be that, you know, landscape urbanism emerged, you know, 20 plus years ago in response to a very particular condition where, in my culture, architecture and urbanism had largely, you know, lacked or failed to develop a kind of environmental position or environmental response. And urban design in particular bet on a kind of traditional, you know, kind of a return to the traditional form of the city. So there was a kind of gap that emerged in my culture. And landscape architects and landscape urbanists stepped into that void to try to reconcile urban form, a kind of progressive design culture, with environmental performance. And that was a unique bedfellow at the time. Subsequently, ecological urbanism and other, you know, agendas have emerged. And those projects and my contributions to them, I think, have been the most valuable in changing the tools, changing the theories, giving us a different way of working. If you change the name of your discipline every time there's a mosquito or a virus or a hurricane, then you're probably lost, right? If you never change your discipline in respect to those societal and environmental conditions, then you become something like, I don't know, opera. I don't know why I pick on opera, but opera comes to mind. I need a good example of a kind of moribund discipline that fails to respond. So in that dialectic, we know that the challenges in the built environment that you will all face in your careers, they don't correspond to disciplinary boundaries. That's precisely why this institution has chosen new frameworks and new lanes, and it said you'll have to invent new practices and new responses. At the same moment, we are architects. So in that reconciliation, landscape urbanism has, I think, been productive and helpful. I'd like to think that it made a contribution. I did my best. But it's also now in what the new urbanism in Andres 20 is called the operational phase. It's out there. You don't need me. It speaks for itself. We have schools, we have practices, it's operational. But it's been mostly effective in the wet work, in the place outside. You know, and when we lack a real precise program of urban form making, I feel like we've fallen back. And I mean that as an indictment of my own project. I believe that we need as robust a toolkit for urban form as we have for the other stuff, the wet stuff. And in that regard, my goal is to have ecologically informed precision. I'm tired of the greenwashing. I'm tired of the idea we'll just make a shape that seems nice or can sell sausage. My goal here is to try to derive urban form, precise urban parameters for urban living from an ecological perspective.
So in a way, one could say that if the history of urbanization has been more centered around, let's say, humans, in a way, this kind of like presents itself almost like a post-human kind of turn, in a way, where all these other agents, all these other wet forms that you talk about, species, water running, topography, soil composition, insects, vegetation, becomes again drivers and have a say into the way we create the kind of like form, right?
Yeah, I'd like to think that. I mean, I think, you know, many of us are interested in deep ecology. Many of us are interested in human, non-human. So on the one hand, I mean, there's no way that all of this is not fundamentally human. We're choosing the species, right? It's not the virus, it's not the mosquito, it's the jujube, right? So there's no way to escape that. But one way of thinking about that as a designer is to think about our embeddedness in relationship to those other species, to decenter ourselves for a moment. Another important moment here is that the history of our fields, as they respond to these topics, have largely been driven from the point of view that if you understand the geology of a place, and therefore its hydrology on top, you can understand its landscape. And I'm not here to be critical of that. It's a long tradition. But my problem is we've done that. We know how to do that. That's not our problem right now. And I think as we think about the planning of the city or the planning of a new town or a kind of new agrarianism, rather than simply looking at the deep geologic structure, which is fine, my goal is to begin with something that's more meaningful to human beings, because the failure in my field has been, we thought that geology should drive. We should just organize the political and economic system along the hydrology. And of course that project failed because of course we don't organize ourselves around hydrology. You know, I understand the utopian impulse that we would live, but that becomes a kind of 20th century desire of landscape planning. This work does the opposite. It says, no, let's take the part of the natural that's meaningful to us and work from that point.
So I want to bring Vicente into the conversation with maybe an underlying question, right? That, I mean, I think you touched upon briefly, but I think it deserves some more reflection, right? Which is this idea of the new town, right? I mean, in a moment where process of urbanization are tending in general to kind of like erase the, you know, monofunctional crops, this idea of the regional specificity kind of like fading down, everything kind of agglomerating towards, you know, big concentration of humans and capital and power. What you are presenting us, despite this idea of being, you know, inspired, driven by the species and this local kind of culinary culture that you can find, you are also proposing that, you know, we're building from scratch. We're building new, you know, new. Even though I know it's a speculation, it's a provocation to try to, you know, a kind of like thought experiment in a way to imagine, to help us kind of like project. I want to, you know, maybe ask Vicente, you know, like somebody that has been very active on the more urban agglomeration front, really doing competition, seeing how cities like redensify and so on. How a new town in this more rural landscape territories, you know, can be conceptualized. Does it make sense? Is there a demand? This idea of the internal surplus absorption of China that is, you know, trying to, you know, create this internal machine can also find an outlet there in the kind of rural area. Vicente, what do you think?
So thank you, Daniel, Charles, for the great lecture. Well, I would like to start contradicting you, Daniel, because, you know, when we work in China, and urbanization, do you know, following the RAT method, making questions, do you know where the word urbanization is coming from? Do you know what it means, urbs? Urbs was the Roman word that defined the moment when someone with a cow was making the line, making the partition between the rural area and what they wanted to be transformed into an urban settlement. You know, that means that in order to make urbanization, all the projects, mostly all the projects we did in China were in agriculture land. But then the idea was to transform this agriculture land into something very dense and so on. So the bad news about China is that what they do is they take wonderful agriculture land. You see that and they say, well, that's incredible. Then first they destroy everything, you know, they urbanize, they make towers or whatever. And then like 20 years later, they say, no, now we would like to do renaturalization. So we would like to find the creeks, the water, every structure that we lost in the process that we did only 20 years ago. And then this is a disaster. So most of our projects, what we have been doing is trying to protect the agriculture that was there. So even trying to follow the pattern that is coming from the agriculture in order to make the cities without making this destruction of the nature. So what I think is great, well, your question is, this kind of scale makes sense? Well, what you call rural settlements, you say from 25 to 50,000, in many places will be a big city or a middle-sized city. In China, obviously, this is a very small town. But what is true is that after this huge process of urbanization, now we are in a moment where when the cities start to meet each other, when you have the high-speed train connecting, they build the best high-speed train network in the world. That means that coming back to a rural settlement, we living with 50,000 people, that, by the way, this is the scale of the so-called slow cities that were invented in Italy, and they follow the Tuscany model of living, having a good life in a good settlement. So this is where they are in fact going back somehow. What I heard about India, we have many Indian students here, is that the discussion about the Indian urbanization is if they should really to develop these big cities as they are doing, but if at the same time they should protect some of these middle and small villages. And the big challenge, in fact, will be what is happening in Africa, where more than 1 billion people will be urbanized in the next 30 years. So they need to build cities for the equivalent of one Barcelona every month in the next 30 years. And the discussion is what they should do with these rural villages, or if they should be organized in a distributed mode that is more like the internet age. No? So I think that the discussion today is that the big and fast urbanization somehow is something everyone is tired. It's true that there are many places like in Africa, some places in Indonesia, for example, they are planning for a new capital and so on. They need to bring people to some more urban conditions. But as you know, during the pandemic in America, the people wanted to live outside and went back to some kind of more non-dense areas. Here, the phenomenon of the neo-ruralism is something is happening with the internet and with the fast connection. So I think that the research that Charles did and their colleagues is absolutely important for the debate that we are having now about how we want to live in the future.
Thank you, Vicente. So maybe following that line, I wanted also to bring maybe the attention to those of you that are not familiarized with the work that Charles did, as well specifically on questions of agrarian urbanism, what I feel this book falls very kind of like nicely. But I would say up until now, mostly your work has been on the kind of discursive, kind of like historical, theoretical kind of front, and probably this kind of new book allows you to kind of like engage with a linealogy of projects, most of them utopian, that kind of fall in this idea of the kind of agricultural kind of urbanism. I'm referring to kind of like projects such as The City in the Landscape by Hillmelsheimer, Broadacre City by Wright, Agronica by Brancy, and many others that you have very, you have been writing about during many years. So is, as part of your trajectory, is this a kind of way of engaging directly with that linealogy that you have very well described? I mean, some of the things you said to us in your writings is that it's true that city has embraced this agricultural production within cities, right? And this kind of food culture within cities, and the fact that we have urban agriculture and all these things occurring here has been created. But what we have been lacking systematically is learning from this food or agriculture as a driver of urban form, as you were saying. So I don't know if you can also in a way help us situate your book within this kind of maybe rather small in quantities, but longer kind of lineage of projects trying to deal with the same question of the agrarian and the urban, not as opposed categories, but rather as a hybrid, right?
Of course, yeah. I mean, I want to also acknowledge Vicente's generosity and deep experience. I'm unburdened by building a lot in China or elsewhere, and that's easy for me, in a way. It's a different kind of labor. The first thing is to do with this question of, a new town, right? Sounds simple enough. It's two words in English that's a compound, but it's also a deep ethical question. I think there are many, many valid reasons why we could agree that we shouldn't be working on greenfield sites, full stop. At the same moment, I like that kind of question, not because it's easy, because I think it's one of the most important ethical challenges for our time. And there are many, I think, people that have argued very, very strongly that in fact, until we figured out how to live in the urban areas we've developed, let's leave the green field alone. At the same moment, the world is continuing to urbanize. And as I said earlier, I do believe that by having a point of view about that process, what I want to say specific to the 50 Species Town project is that this is a very real thing that our friends in China are building right now with respect to their own models. And those models are not based on the identification of a jujube. Rather, they're based on a certain kind of real estate promotion, a certain kind of advertising campaign, right? They're basically selling you the image of the thing they just destroyed that Vicente mentioned, right? So they destroy what's there, and then they build a big poster, right? I mean, there's a long history of that in the West. I grew up in Florida in a place called Pine Hills, which in order to build, they knocked down the hills and the pine trees, right? So there's a long history of that in land development. But I do believe as we continue to urbanize, there's a way that we can do it thoughtfully, you know, and as we look at the new ruralism around the world, as we look at this is all pre-COVID, COVID accelerates that. And so finding a way to think about that. With respect to the agrarian, yes, it's true. When we were developing landscape urbanism, we were using effectively discursive methods, theories to change hearts and minds, shape ideas, but we were using studio pedagogy and institutions of design, schools of design, to develop new tools. So me in Chicago, Jim Corner at Penn, Mostafavi in London, people working elsewhere, we were using the labor of the school. And so in this case, what's different is we're doing this as research, not as teaching. And that changes it a little bit. It changes the meaning and the status of it a little bit. So I'd like to think we've always been projective, but I think what you're picking up on is rather than relying upon the work of students to represent that projective desire, our goal is to represent it ourselves. And hopefully, if we get it right, contribute to that genealogy of Andrea Branzi and Hilbersheimer and others.
So maybe as a follow-up question on that, Charles, you know, one of the things that we have been trying to promote at IAAC for many years is this idea of, you know, design research, right? Design research as a very unique kind of like form of both knowledge, but also, you know, projection that is very specific to the design disciplines. And I, you know, personally think after also working with you for many years that this is a great example of how these projects, you know, creates knowledge about a place through the graphics, through the facts, through the narratives, through the selection of species, through the beautiful photographic kind of like essays, but simultaneously it's not stopping in a kind of analytical, descriptive genre, but it's really complementing that with the kind of projective speculation, scenario-based kind of like design. No? So is nor the combination of an analytical book and a projective book, but really the kind of entanglement, right, between the two. So again, this, you know, regardless of the specific topic of a kind of agrarian urbanism, or in this case formalized in the species towns, could you talk a little bit from a methodological perspective how you guys have done that, why that's important, why design research as a kind of rubric to you know to operate on our field?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I appreciate the generosity of that opening, Danny. I mean, I think the first thing to say is my general sense is that we're all doing the same thing. We're doing different things, obviously. But what I mean is, you know, we're all trying to, you know, both develop new ideas, develop new knowledge. In other parts of universities, I know that you guys have a relationship with the Polytechnic. You know, in a campus like ours, for example, every discipline on campus produces knowledge in their own way. I think what's unique in the design disciplines is that the projects that you make, the things that you build, the hypotheses that you develop, they stand in a double status. They are both things you could do next week, but they also form the body of knowledge of our field, right? And so in the sciences, that's not the case. Most often in sciences, the scientist is meant to observe, make an hypothesis, test, falsify, make new knowledge, but without intervening. As urbanists, I believe that our mandate is we can't wait for all the data. There's no shortage of data, right? The city is this enormous longitudinal multivariate problem set, and I think we have to intervene on Monday. You know, we can't wait. And because of that complexity, often the city and the study of the city, on the one hand, attracts a kind of kind of Serdaean kind of analytical, mathematical, empirical, or parametric precision. It's a desire. We often, if we can get the buses to run horizontally and vertically and be more, if we can get all the data or the cell phone, we can somehow, and then at the same time, the city is the site of resistance, right? The city is the site of lived experience, because we're here, we live on the ground, we vote with our feet, with our dollars, with our euro. Ultimately, that push-pull I find really, really interesting. And in this context, we are aware that what we're doing is meant to be for multiple audiences. Of course, we share this in Mandarin with our friends in China and say, we think you should do this on Monday. We're happy to help. We think this would be better than what you're doing right now. But it's also meant to provide a kind of example for how we go about approaching problems. So for us, it's important to acknowledge both of those audiences, but to not change the script for those two. That's my goal, is that we can say the same book, same outcome for every audience. So that's not easy to do. And along the way, that means citing your sources, acknowledging your contributors, making sure that you've shown your homework in a way. That would be what I would say.
Vicente, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so following this explanation, I would like to make 2 comments about your book. The first is that I see an incredible work working with parametric design. So you was talking about these patterns of urbanization, and somehow you were trying to understand and follow some natural forms in order to develop some geometrical rules in order to develop some settlements, no? And I think that the work you have been doing is showing a very high capacity of control of the computer in order to produce like different settlements with different density and form, etc. And I think this is also important in this context, because you need to remember, all IAAC students, that you need to control the computer. The computer should not control you. That's something fundamental, because you see many times when you feel that you are enjoying too much finding new forms, computer is controlling you. So you need really to remember, because I see this of many students, and this is one of the drama of the idea of not drawing by hand, by drawing by computer, is that somehow the guy that make the software is the guy that is doing the drawing, and you are like a kind of middleman or middlewoman for that. So remember, if you enjoy so much on what the computer is doing, computer is controlling you. But the second thing is another idea that I discovered also working in China and looking also to the American academia, that somehow the first wall is where the distance between ideas and reality are shorter. Somehow in Silicon Valley, you see people doing incredible parametric stuff, applications and so on, and the day after they are in the market and they are changing the world. That's great. Or in China, you see people doing incredible productions and manufacturing and things, inventing machines, and this is somehow happening. But the bad news is that what you see in China, and you explain that in parallel of you making these drawings, the developers were doing their job. And then the distance between, I would say, academia and reality is very big. And in fact, this is somehow what we discovered in places like in CERN and others, where you see people learning how to use tools, machines, and design things. But then the reality, the cities that they are building outside are completely different. So I would say that America, from that point of view, is the third world, no? In a kind of provocative statement, but because the distance between the more radical ideas about design and use of computation to make cities is very far away from the reality. From this point of view, I would say that Barcelona is, I don't want to say that we are the first world, but if you see the idea of how that the radicality is not very high, but it's very positive. What you saw about the ideas taking the bike, this is already happening there, about Daniel, me, and others working in the Mies Pavilion using timber, building things, that's reality, And I would say that this is another big effort that you should be doing, that is trying to approach the big ideas with the goals of transforming the reality. because if not, you will be more in the comic side than not in the architecture and urban planner side. And I think that, I mean, what is great about your work is that you have been working with a very high precision, with the tools that you have, with the reference that you have. The pictures that you did are incredible. So you do a kind of socio-economical and cultural studies about how you really want to integrate your project in that place. And I feel that this is something kind of real. So from that point of view, this could be the first wall or the new generation of things to come.
It's very generous. I want to reinforce this notion of my culture as the third world. I won't go too long, but I can say a few things. You know, my colleague and friend Raul Marotra, who's chair of urban planning at the GSD at Harvard, he's big in using the formulation majority and minority world. I don't know if that would work for you, but I'm very happy referring to the majority world, which is largely the global south, where most of the urbanization will continue to happen, where most have lived, you know, something like, you know, most of lived human experience will happen. And at the same moment, my culture is a cautionary tale. We don't believe of housing as a fundamental human right. We don't believe of education or healthcare as something that's fundamental. These are luxury goods. The entire culture has been commodified. And in that regard, you know, design culture vis-a-vis the urban, you know, in America occupies what Hannah Arendt calls a kind of in-migrated position. It's held in reserve, like in a kind of pancreas. It's kind of, we've in-migrated it because it doesn't really exist in the world that we live in today, which is primarily about capital flows. In that regard, I also want to just reinforce, since we're here on the inaugural speech for the launch of a new academic year, you know, this notion of your tools, not letting your tools to drive you. And a part of what we're trying to get at in our work is, because we know that tools, any way of working in representation is our burden, you are architects to the extent you do not build. You don't go in the world and build. If you did, you wouldn't be an architect. As an architect, you draw. Somebody else builds what you draw. That's existential for us. In that condition, how you draw, and whether the drawing is drawing you or you're drawing it, is a fundamental condition. And it's this classic dialectic between literacy. You have to learn piano, you have to learn Catalan, you have to learn something of the language, and then you have to express yourself through it. So what I'm trying to do here is, how do I find an expressive range? Because difference for me is one good way to find out if you're running the tool, or if the tools, if everything starts to look the same, no matter how, if it's fashionable, that's also a bit of a problem. And then, you know, the last thing I wanted to, you know, return to is basically Aretti's call at the beginning of the academic year. And this great opportunity for you to be rigorous and apply yourself, and to also to communicate that work and to share it with others, right? It's a socialization of that experience as much as it is your own, you know, your own making of it.
Beautiful. Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Vicente.